Welcome to Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, a second conference about reimagining international development. My name is Swati Deepak, and I'm the director of the With and For Girls Collective, which is the world's only participatory fund with and for girls. In this conversation, I'll be joined by Ponzo Mafiti, who led feminist women's rights programs at Comic Relief for many years and was named one of BBC's 100 Women to Watch. Mitali Sen, Zora Musa, who's the executive director of Mama Cash. Bonnie Chu, with the social investment consultancy and a writer for Forbes. And Stephanie Yawa de Wolf, who is formerly with the Global Fund for Children, Thousand Currents, and is a co-founder of Africans in the Diaspora. This conversation stems from one that Ponzo and I had over a drink one day, discussing our experiences of being women of colour within philanthropy.
As Swati said, we've had this conversation, and I think what was very clear to us was that if we were feeling that way, there probably were others out there who were also wondering whether their feeling was just them or whether it was something broader. So we thought it would be really good to have a group come together to talk about and share our experiences of racism in philanthropy and in international development, and to talk about how being a woman of colour frames how we feel we're treated, and how exhausting it is actually to be feeling like we're working constantly to demonstrate our value in a system that we don't recognise, that we don't feel recognises the enormous contribution and the deep relevances and lives and identities that we bring as women of colour to everything we do. So we hope this conversation will resonate with others who've perhaps also felt like, as minorities in predominantly white organisations, they don't feel they're heard or understood. And also open that conversation so that within organisations, we can understand better the value that the diversity of the workforce brings, particularly when the issues you're dealing with are about communities of colour.
Within philanthropy, I feel racism in a much more acute way than I did in any other sector before. I think it's just that actually in other spaces, I didn't feel like it was so visceral in how your professional value was seen and not seen as it's been in coming into philanthropy. And I would say that even it was there within development and within kind of the INGOs or development spaces. But I feel that in philanthropy, and especially being in progressive philanthropy spaces, if I can use that word, I think that, there's a lot of conversation around shifting power. There's a lot of acknowledgement of things like intersectionality. People want to talk about it and acknowledge that they're taking those frames. But I think the way that, for me, I've seen it play out has been really difficult. And so there's just these layers of like, even who gets to be a philanthropist and who gets to hold power, whether it's someone who has got a significant amount of wealth or whether it's even somebody who's just working in that place, I think has been hard to navigate. I think as well, it's just been hard for me to navigate the actual, how that manifests in the way of who comes to the table to develop and frame different strategies, and how, a lot of our work and a lot of my work within philanthropy has been getting funds to really small grassroots groups around the world that are led by adolescent girls, and they're excluded in a whole bunch of other ways. But I think for me, what I've also seen is just how, working within sort of that frame, it's like nothing is taken seriously because of who you are and who you represent, and that being a marker for that. And also how grassroots organizations are not actually supported through philanthropic systems. They're distrusted. They have layers and layers of hoops to kind of jump through in order to get funding. And I'm saying this from our from the sector experience of what I've seen. This sort of just innate distrust that exists, that's obviously a harker of colonialism manifesting today. And then I think what I've also found probably the hardest, more than the who holds power, who gets a seat at the table, and how do we actually build strategies and interact with our grantee partners and why, I think I've also found it hard to also be in spaces where people are manifesting and claiming to be really supportive of race and intersectionalities, and yet the way that you are treated and the inferred issues that you have to navigate are deeply difficult, and they actually send you a little bit crazy, to be honest. You start wondering whether you're just manifesting things in your own insensitivities, or your own sensitivities, sorry, or you're just, it hits your confidence in a different way. And so that's just, I guess, a bit of a framing for what motivated me for this conversation. But I also feel like addressing this issue is actually, and I think, Steph, you framed it really nicely when you were saying earlier around how does the manifestation of these issues actually prevent us from being able to solve the big issues that philanthropy and development is trying to do something about? And how do we, and Ada, you also said, how can we deconstruct a system that wasn't made for us and wasn't intended to actually bring in those views? So I think a lot of those things and a lot of what everyone has said has really kind of holds true from that. So I'm just going to pass it on to somebody. I'm going to pick on you, Ponzo, because I feel like I've spoken to you most about this issue, and I'm just keen to hear and to share whatever you'd like to with the group, but particularly, what do you hope this conversation can start or help catalyze, and what brought you to the conversation?
Thanks, Lottie. I will probably talk a little bit more about what brought me to this conversation. And I think it very much, when we started, I spoke about where I was born, where I spent my formative years. Those were countries which were either sort of at the tail end of colonial rule or still going through the independence struggles. And so my early experience was very much defined by and dictated by the race that I was. In coming into development, I felt that I could bring an experience, a lived experience, that understood where the intersections of race impacted on everything about the communities that the international development sector was aiming to work on. When I started, I always remember the very first bond meeting that I went to, which was about organisations, UK organisations that were predominantly working on development, many of them or most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, and being the only Black African woman in the room, and thinking, this is a little bit weird, this is very strange. I have friends and family here, many who are well qualified, but none of them were represented apart from through myself. And I think it was that early recognition of the very, very limited, if not completely erased, role that African voices play in the UK development sector. I think through the years that I worked, there were many things. It was about, and I think this speaks to what you mentioned about your work with adolescent girls organisations, where there was a sort of level of distrust. And when funding was being discussed for big international organisations, I think the level of scrutiny was much less than when it was for small African diaspora organisations. So that was another thing. I think it was this sense that actually, if things are to change, things will be changed as a result of the effort, the energy, and the drive of communities themselves. and we should be looking at how to support those. And unless you really understand those structures, it's very difficult to understand how your interventions will be meaningful and sustainable. And I think, you know, the more I thought about it, what I recognized, and I think this is very much now, you know, we have conversations around diversity and inclusion, and I think that's really important. But I think in the absence of really interrogating why the structures as they are, we really need, I think, to start talking about racism and not tiptoe around and call it whatever colonial undertones or you know, sort of exclusion, or call it diversity, or referring to it as diversity, because actually it's a structural thing, and without understanding the structural underpinnings of why it exists as it does, why people of colour who are working in this sector still are feeling marginalised, speaks to something which is much more structural. And so the kind of piecemeal addressing through individual projects, I feel, will never ever be able to fully, you know, address these fundamental structural issues, which I think are parlaying out in a new form of colonialism, which itself is not addressing what the causes of this disparity around race, you know, focusing everything through a lens, what I think is, what I've seen referred to as the white gaze of development, where the norm is seen in one way and everybody else is othered. So for me, it's very much about really, really pushing into those uncomfortable conversations and addressing the fact that as people of colour working in an industry in a context which is predominantly white, there are feelings, there are histories which without an understanding of will prohibit moving forward.
Steph, you were nodding a lot. Do you want to share some of your reflections or some of your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think immediately of the like kind of overly quoted, well-known quote by Audre Lorde that the master's house cannot be dismantled by the master's tools, which is to say, I like vehemently agree that this is a structural issue. And I think for me, the structural issue is so essential to resolve because there's also a spiritual question for me, which is the one of how do we get free if the structures in question create a landscape where the sort of consequences that emerge from what Ponsu, I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Did I pronounce it? Okay.
Absolutely.
From what Ponsu just sort of laid out for us, what are the consequences when the white gaze others us in its own systems of creation? What are the consequences when Africans grow up devaluing themselves? And, you know, please note that like every time I'm using Africans, I widely understand that this applies to many different subgroups. I can just speak from an African perspective. Because I think that what's effectively happening is we're gradually, actually rapidly eroding our own understanding of our cultural value and our contributions to modernity. We really risk creating a false narrative of who we are. And coming at this from the perspective of a medical anthropologist, what happens then when we devalue ourselves according to these structures, according to the white gaze, is we die. We experience racial health disparities at disproportionate rates. We don't have examples of our dignity and our worth to tell us that we can overcome the circumstances of these built environments that we lived on. So this becomes a real spiritual question and a question of collective psyche when institutions and structures like this possess so much capital that for us to be driving forward a reperpetuation of these structures rather than actually creating new and alternative ones using modes of engagement that are different from the modes of engagement that built these structures. It's funny because I can't remember how I started that sentence, but there are grave consequences and they live in our bodies. And I think that for some of us, this is not a question of the good work we get to do and then go home. It's a question of our people, the people who raised us, who moved us, who have shaped us, and understanding that they don't get to experience dignified lives. They don't even get to grow up understanding their own inherent value and the beautiful legacies that they represent. And so I think too, like, to take it a step further, I'm like totally with you, but I'm also like, so what does it mean to build structures from the ground up that are using distinctly different modes of engagement, and to name that we must use different modes of engagement if we want to create structures in which agents can act differently. Because inevitably what we have in this moment is a lot of, it's like, the way that progress works is folks like us get into these structures and we can move things forward a little bit. But I do profoundly wonder what impact, what getting to the root of the issue, so radical in the sense of what is at the root of this? What's at the foundation? What can change unless we design these structures differently? And that's where I get excited about some of the experiments and modeling that many of you have done on projects or at your own organizations, because I do believe it's possible. But I think that the kind of the thing that moves me so much is this notion that if we aren't engaging in creating this redesign, there is so much that's at stake, and there is so much that happens when the white gaze convinces people that their heritage is not of value. And that's, I think, as someone, I've sort of moved through the world having to make a case for why Africa matters, whether that was in international school communities with other international school students in Africa, whether that was at my university in the state of Virginia, where, the highest population of enslaved people kind of moved through the United States. And so there is this way in which I've been shown from life experience that there is great value when Black people don't understand their worth or the actual contributions they've made to societies that we live in today. And so I guess, I just want to add that for me, that's kind of the consequence of everything that you outlined for us, Ponso.
Zora, I saw you nodding along as well. I wondered whether you wanted to share some of your thoughts.
Sure. A little bit hard to follow all that, other than to say yes. So maybe I'll start from my place, which is I was just jotting down kind of what's it like to be me in the space. And so there's a few things. One is a little bit what Ponce said. There is only me in the space often. So I'm in a room full of white folks, and very often the only definitely woman of color, possibly person of color, because there's usually one other man of color in some of the spaces, if that, right? Definitely not more than two people of color, and definitely not more than one woman of color. There's some kind of quota system going on there about like maximum number of us allowed in a room at a time in some of these spaces. And so I've sometimes taken to doing this thing, which is literally counting. So
yes.
How many men are here? How many women are here? How many folks of color? Do I see any queer people? Anybody, whatever the differences are, and just tallying, and kind of for my mental health and spiritual health, I message back to my colleagues, and I'm like, sitting in a room of this to just like visibilize what it is to try and move through these spaces and have it be held somewhere other than in my body. So as a kind of, active record, active witnessing of what's happening here, because I believe in the work I do, and I love the institution I work for, but it requires that I am subject to violence by having to go into these spaces and be the only and hold ground there. So I put that back to the organization to say that this is where I am right now. This is what I'm experiencing right now.
Yes.
The second thing is that when I'm invited into these spaces as a knowledge holder, it's as an expert on diversity and inclusion, right? So back to what you were mentioning, Ponso, is I'm supposedly terribly knowledgeable about diversity and inclusion and not much else. So I'm, invoked a lot on those and similar kinds of topics. I definitely can speak to those topics, but obviously we can speak to other kinds of topics, right? And so the idea that my contribution is just constantly racialized, and the platforms I'm offered are to do with that, instead of the many other topics I might be able to speak on, and etc. I see lots of nods. And just say that work's not paid as well as other work, right? So if I wanted to speak on that, and it was treated as an area of expertise rather than opinion, for instance, that would be compensated in a different way, but it isn't. It's seen as, could you just tell us a little bit about, could you just tell us how to, in 3 steps, da 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 da.
Yeah.
The third related is my organization, Mama Cash, is a funder, but it also is a fundraiser. So we seek to mobilize resources. And the kind of resources we have access to, even though I'm on like the side of philanthropy in that we're a funder, what we're actually able to mobilize is just peanuts. It's a joke. It's a colossal joke for the kind of work that we are supporting, and the kind of change that we back, and the kind of people whose visions and transformations, what they're up to, just the courage and just the sheerness of it, right? And the level of kind of proof tests, and a little bit what we were speaking about earlier, the kind of what counts as risky, and our work is seen as terribly risky, even though everything else that people are doing right now isn't working, is failing, is driving us underground, destroying the planet. How in the world could we be perceived as being risky when we're just the opposite of that? Sure, so there's the logics don't work. But always having to reprove or have a kind of standard around proof of concept or evidence or impact or these kinds of things that just aren't true for other kinds of innovative work or other kinds of innovation or experimentation that are backed because of who's leading that work. Who's leading this work is exactly why it's seen as risky, right? Instead of the opposite. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about was just the kind of emotional and care load of doing this work and being in this body doing this work, because of where we're situated and all the dynamics around it, how I'm read, and the fact that philanthropy is very, is white, is elitist, is classist, is all of it. And philanthropy is about relationships. And so if you have an entire industry that is inhabited or held or reinforced through a certain kind of people, and it's about relationships, what does that do to us in terms of shifting resources and power and money, right? So it's all so coded, it's all so layered. All the stuff around passing and just the performative element to be received as intelligent, capable, whatever. The kind of work I have to do to just, soften the edges, right? Soften the edges, smooth out the this, glossify that, and I talk about, like I joke with my colleagues, like I have to go put on the drag of being this particular kind of person who occupies the spaces, because I can't be taken seriously otherwise, right? So certain kinds of haircuts, absolutely non-optional for me. Certain kinds of clothing that I would love to wear, just not optional, but other people could pull it off if they were white, right? Because they're seen as like, oh, that's so edgy. And I'm not read that way if I have the same kind of clothing or haircut or whatever, and I watch them be, all hip and cool and whatever, and I just have to be this other person in this drag, because my professionalism or my qualities, my skills, my talents just aren't received well. I just have to jump through all these extra things. So that's what I can offer to this conversation about what it's like to be some of us in some of these spaces.
Yeah, I think you've probably hit the nail on the head, which is why I think why a lot of people are attracted to having this conversation is because a lot of us are the onlys and we're navigating the onlys. And I think, Zora, you summed it up really well, like the load that it actually has emotionally and physically on our bodies as well. Mitali, you've taken your mute off, so I'm going to pass to you.
Thanks, Swati. A lot to take in, quite hard to follow everything that's already been said. Agree with a lot of what's been said. I think I kind of landed in philanthropy just accidentally. It wasn't an intentional move. I came to this space from Black-led women's rights organisations, and I think I stepped into this space very naive and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and was quite quickly given quite a real introduction into what mainstream philanthropy in the global north is like. And there's so many aspects of the space that I'm in that I've struggled with, and I think kind of some of the shift the power conversations have been probably given me the energy and the hope that I've needed, and a space to engage with people who certainly feel like within the funding space, who want to move, who want to really kind of at its most radical, change the whole paradigm. At not so radical level, reform our problematic ways and institutions. I definitely agree with Swati that trying to have conversations about race, even in these spaces, is very difficult. I rarely even hear the word race or racism in the spaces that I'm in, and it almost makes me shy to even say it, because I'm like, oh, is this going to just the word alone feels so scary to so many people. And I think being in the UK, we nearly always, well, not us, but the people that we work around, just reduce. We just go to this kind of language of BAME, BME, and now BAMER. And I think the day that somebody first said BAMER to me in the office, I was like, oh, is that a joke? Is that like, oh, I'm more BAME than you? And then someone was like, no, it's official. They've added refugees onto BAME. And I was just horrified and just like, where do you even start? So it's been difficult. And yeah, it's interesting because I think for a lot of you, perhaps I don't know if it's that you're in different spaces to me, or if it's just that you've got more experience than me, but I speak to a lot of people either within the charity space or the philanthropy space, people of colour, who say they often get called upon to be that DE&I person, to comment on intersectionality, to comment on inclusion, and that's exhausting, and it feels very extractive and tokenistic. And it's really interesting for me to hear those experiences, because I feel like in the spaces that I'm in, I actually never even get called upon to be that person or that voice. That actually D&I, diversity and inclusion, tends to fall on or fall to white women, white middle class women who are either disabled or a sexual minority, or have a different aspect of their identity, which certainly means that they experience prejudice and discrimination in certain ways, but they're not talking about race, and they're certainly not talking about race in the way that it needs to be spoken about. And it's rare that they will bring women of colour or men of colour on that journey with them. And when we do get brought on, it's very much on their terms, and to do specific activities or specific trainings or to have specific conversations. And you're very much just included. There's no control or power over that agenda or conversation, which I just find extremely toxic and exhausting. I think the conversation about, do we try and reform the structures that we're in, or do we try and build something different? Because as you said, Stephanie, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tool. I think that I'm kind of at a crossroad now where I'm like, where do I put my energy, and where can I be most strategic? Because I have been in the mainstream space for over a year now. And I do feel like on one hand, if you can influence the space, the mainstream space, it can be catalytic and it can have a huge impact. And I think we need to reform and change the mainstream space, because I think there is a responsibility And I think I'm just trying to grapple with, when we build something, an alternative system and an alternative structure, does that give those in the mainstream space an excuse or just material or something to be able to say, oh, we don't need to do this anymore? And actually, I think we do. I think states in the global north we have to be involved in reparations. We have to be involved in redistributing the wealth that we have. But also, I think you have to be realistic about where you can make change. And I've been in this space for just over a year now, and I've seen so many amazing black and brown and women and men and get burnt out and leave. And they're 3, 4 or 5 years, created amazing change within there. And then as soon as they've left, within 2, everything's been dismantled because they've embedded. And so I'm just kind of at that point now where I'm like, where is my energy most effective? Where can I be most strategic? And also, how can I look after myself best? I do find places that I'm in extremely toxic, and I'm relatively young, and I'm worried that I'm going to become too cynical too quickly and get burnt out and leave, and I don't want to. I just think that I just need to be part of these types of conversations to really think critically about, where can I go? How do I sustain myself? How do I not burn out and leave, which I don't want to do. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at and why this conversation is so valuable for me.
So much. Bonnie, I think you've got to go.
Yes, I was just
sorry. I just saw that message. I'm so sorry I didn't pick up earlier. You want to go?
Yeah, I would say a few things. I think it's quite worrying that we hear the same story of burnout and disillusionment and disappointment. And it's a story that we really need to tell to the philanthropy community. I don't have anything to add on the systems level. All your diagnosis is completely right. I think I keep my sanity because I am not working 100% in philanthropy, looking at my time. I find that, like what Swati said, I find that philanthropy has this really visceral toxicity, but everyone's just too nice to talk about it. And it's something I can't really pinpoint. There's something about like money and like wealth that just silences people. And there's something about doing good and people just wanting to feel good that we don't get to the heart of the exploitation that's going on. What I find interesting is that I've been fighting gender equality for quite a while. I don't get the same burnout from talking about feminism and gender equality as I do about racism. And I don't know why that is. I'm still trying to dig deeper. And I think for me, it might just be my personal experience that I've never been grown, or I've never been conditioned to feel bad about my gender. Like I know that it's not great being a woman, but I've grown to, like, I guess, embrace my gender identity, and then I reflect on my experience about race. And I grew up in Hong Kong. It was a British colony until 1997, and I grew up knowing that I hate my skin color and I should be as white as possible because that's where I could be seen as pretty and that I could get good, far in life. And I mean, I know it was a very small thing, like I'm just naturally more tan than my classmates, but it was such a thing that defined my worldview. And like actually growing up wishing every day that I was white is very toxic. And I've just grown to realize that actually, I think this year I've grown to talk about racism in the past, I think 3 years. But it never occurred to me why emotionally it damages me so much. But it was actually a few months ago that I started having conversation about racism, and then something ticked, and I remember my childhood experience of being bullied because of my skin color, and that I'm just like, wow, like just kind of this bomb, a bit like what Swati perhaps has experienced in your childhood, and like you being bullied because of your accent and because of where you're from. So I think we need to be honest about the burnout and the mental damage that is really doing to people of color, especially women of color who are facing the double whammy of sexism and racism. And I think, like Mitali, I'm getting to a point that I'm like, where can I have the most impact? And this system is crushing me so much that I kind of feel maybe I shouldn't be investing so much of my energy in it because I need to protect myself. But it will be a shame for all of us to leave the sector or not to spend as much time in it, because this sector still has the power, and it is one of the ways that we are, achieving the sustainable development goals or whatever social change we want to create. But I'm just so glad we were able to open our hearts and like really pour our heart and soul in this 1 hour conversation. It's time to be talking about racism very directly in philanthropy. I don't know if the conversations will change things, but even if we just like explode and like, in front of all these people and be like, we're out, that will cause a moment of reckoning among these philanthropists who hold the power. And maybe we can, go off and create a system and like make lots of money and, be philanthropists ourselves if this way doesn't work. But I feel at least we need to try and do that.
Thank you. I'm just going to sort of round up a lot of the themes that I think have come up and then just like leave everyone to say like one last reflection. I'm just really conscious of people's time and how busy everyone is as well. But yeah, thank you so much. It's been really lovely to hear from everybody. It's kind of made me think we need to have more conversations like this and slightly longer ones so that we can get into a little bit of detail and depth about some of these issues, because I think some of them have really emotional and like physical impacts on people that feel, when you're feeling really isolated and othered, and you've grown up like within that system that's made you feel and behave and navigate in that way. I think there's how do you hold space for that in the right way? And then I think, how do we acknowledge that need to hold space in order to reimagine what a different reality could look like? What does a new system of dismantling this structure look like, either from within or creating an alternative one? And who are the people that care to listen to those points? But I think some of the things, I mean, everyone spoke really personally from personal spaces, but I think there was a lot of the entering into this space feeling really hopeful, and also feeling like your identity either was something that was, it actually gave you validity when you were entering the space. It was like, I actually know about these issues. I have something to say and to contribute. And I know that my viewpoints and my expertise and my experience that's deeply personal and professional can really help grow this space. But also just seeing how the lack of representation of faces like ours and experiences like ours actually made you feel invalid in those spaces. And that the validity was given in a different way, that power had been shaped around this kind of system of value and validity, that although externally you came into it feeling that way, it wasn't necessarily acknowledged or given space to. I think that there was a lot of, then how does this system around us that is without, like philanthropy is inherently like an unjust system. It's been created by people who have amassed significant amounts of wealth because of a broken capitalist system, and we are here trying to create some way of that circling back, which in and of itself is a problem, right? But we also see that it has tremendous opportunity to try and do something, because there are resources there that a lot of communities and people are being denied, and a lot of it is still being shaped by it's still being shaped by white people. I think I shared a stat with you guys that 99% of foundation trustees are white. And that gave me the impetus. I am like actively looking to be on foundation boards that don't have any non-white representation on, because I was so shocked at that statistic. And obviously I come from that space where I totally know that that's the system that we work in. I think that it speaks to that whole shock of being in somewhere that's attempting or saying that it wants to shift the power and just not. And that actually some of those areas speak for themselves. I think that there was a lot of I really like, Zora, you brought up quite a lot in terms of how do I visualize and document this, and how do I share that reality? And I think that that's a really nice thing that we should all be, not a nice thing, I think it's obviously a deeply traumatic thing to have to visualize and have to acknowledge and have to share and to sit with. And the fact that you're in those spaces holding that is deeply traumatic. But I think for me, it gave me a bit of a, if we all start doing this, maybe there'd be a different acknowledgement of the situation. And I don't know how other people feel about that, but I'm seeing nodding faces. So I think that it's a really nice thought of how do we create systems to visibilize this issue and to share that experience with people that aren't people of color navigating this space. I think there was like can we just talk about racism and race as an issue and not mark it in diversity, inclusion, BEMA, whatever. Every country has got its own framing. What can we do around it? How do we also get seen for the expertise that we have and the positions that we hold in our organization without not just always being the default racial expert, diversity expert, inclusion expert, and what does that mean in terms of the way that there's like an extractivist, can't even say my words, thought around that, and also the emotional care load. I think Bonnie, you shared a lot around how do we like really visualize that this is something that's like been really internal to a lot of people, and I think almost that it's the structural issues that we're sat with is having an emotional effect, but it's also like something that's coming to light for a system that exists around us, and I think also there was the issues that Steph and Ponzo, you guys brought up around the white gaze, and what does this actually mean in terms of the way that philanthropy or development has been structured, and the way that the structures actually manifest and create that sort of space of distrust when we're actually building strategies and looking at where our funding goes and why. And also is something that is actually stopping us from all of these right-wing forces that are globally attacking, and also just is stopping anything truly meaningful or sustainable happening. I don't know if I've done justice to our summary, but just to kind of help that. But I just wanted to, I guess, leave space for everyone to just share a final sort of thought, remark, question.
Sure. I wanted to come back to the point about care load, because I think I didn't really explain that. And what I meant by that was the way things are received when bodies like ours express them is not neutral, right? And so if we want to call out racism or name it or whatever it is, there's a whole bunch of care work that has to go into that by us to take care of the people who we're then trying to confront. And I don't mean that as we should do that. I mean, that is what ends up happening, is we have to maintain the relations, keep things moving, to protect our institutions, to protect our kind of ability to carry on the relationship and get other work done. It's not so easy to just name a thing or call out a thing and keep it moving. It actually takes an enormous amount of work to hold people through that. And all the explaining and the training that goes into that. Of course, we all know that, but there's a specific piece around what I've experienced where it is care work. It's a huge emotional labor piece that I know I've had to do, even with people who are progressive, definitely on board, want to do all this work. And it's kind of, I don't know if this is true, but sometimes it feels like this. It's kind of worse because they're so right on. So they really want to do the right thing. They're good-hearted and want to do the right thing. And so, you're giving more because you want it to work. And it's just exhausting, as opposed to people who kind of don't care, kind of aren't that interested. And so when you call it out, they're like, whatever, and maybe they'll think about it and maybe they won't, but you can name it and move on, in a way that when you're in relation or in community with people who are also, coming from the same values or whatever, you can't just name it and move on. So if you name it, you're in for some work, which doesn't mean you shouldn't name it, but just to acknowledge that is work. And especially because, we're all women of color, we're all racialized women, so we're expected to care that emotional part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Steph, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Just a quick add-on. I think we're expected to do it, and it comes with so much ease, depending on your experience. I know that I've had to really, because of my experiences in philanthropy, like really get kind of reduced to like a physical and mental version of myself that I hardly recognized, because that was the degree to which I didn't understand that I had been wired to putting other people's comfort before my own. And so then this experience being something I was constantly having and internalizing, like it was like unbeknownst to me, I was then taking that gradually depleting well and making sure that everyone around me, including the people that were making me feel that way, still felt comfortable around how they were engaging with me. And it's from that place that I think I want to leave us with an honest and sincere question that I'm really thinking about, which is, what does it mean to engage in a space like this, where we have been able to come together as strangers, well, some of us, but come together as people not really working on together on a day-to-day basis as a collective or a group, and see ourselves in one another and affirm one another and feel what the other feels, without the question of what we are saying to a white audience or a white gaze. What does it mean for us to engage in this conversation with a very narrow audience that is from us to ourselves, and in an unapologetic way that doesn't seek to explain, but rather seeks to affirm from where we know we are, rather than come down here to have to explain to others where we are? I mean, it's a sincere question, because there's a lot also that is exclusive about that approach. But I think a lot about how the pattern I was hearing is everyone's apprehension and attention to, I'm kind of conserving my energy because I'm not so sure where I can go in this space. And so from that place, what does it mean for us to stay in this same protective space, but start to really fill our collective well, so that when we go into the world and we're not apologetic, we know that we're validated in that? It's a real question.
Thank you. Mitali, can see you looking off.
Yeah, just trying to kind of process that. I think I just wanted to make one to add on the care point that Laura made so well, that there is a lot of work to do in carrying people through these processes and these conversations. And I also think it's not just about doing that. Like, I think I was perhaps not really conscious of that until I realized the risk to myself of not doing it. Where a colleague was in a space that she was exposed to some quite frank, tough conversations around race, and it set off her white fragility to a point that she then went and, well, was about to go and have a conversation with an evaluator of the program that this particular grantee was on, to say that she had real concerns with this organisation because she was confronted with the race conversation in a way that was just, she could not engage with. It was just too, just too difficult for her. And I think that gave me such a real sense of how high the stakes are when you don't take on the care for other people, even though it's completely unfair and unjust for us to have to do that. And I think that's definitely made me very cautious of what I say to who in some ways, but then in other ways, I get so fed up and so frustrated on certain days that it then comes out in quite reckless ways. And so I either say nothing and I then beat myself up after for saying nothing, or I say something in a way that was not careful because I just, my emotions take over rather than being careful, knowing full well the possible implications of not treading in a careful way. So yeah, that was just kind of to add on to that, that I think it's a really important point that you raised, Zora.
Thank you so much, Mitali. Ponzo, last word.
Oh, okay. I've got just a couple of things that I want to say, and I think I'm very struck by that stat around the representation on trustee boards in the UK, where 99% are white. And I think that's a really important thing. But I also think, and I think our collective sharing of experiences just today speaks to the fact that there is very little representation in the kind of general organisations. And I say that because certainly in my experience of working, while obviously the trustees and the committees and the advisory this and advisory that are important, I am convinced that the decisions on where the money goes and how are made before the paperwork gets to those decision makers. It's made by the members of the team. And I think when teams do not reflect or represent or understand the culture, the politics, the structures of the context in which they are making decisions on, it's always going to be flawed. So I think this whole thing about representation, where a lot of the conversation has been around representation on boards, is really important. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the experiences that we've shared of being the only one in the more operational side of things is really, really important. So that was the one thing. And then, I have to say there was something quite liberating for me after leaving the organisation that I was with after 16 years, because I wasn't always quite so self-contained in sharing my opinion on things. And I did feel progressively as I got older, more fed up, more confident in myself, able to call things out. But I would also say that I think this whole sort of shared experience of always holding back ourselves to prevent causing hurt or upset, and is never going to move the needle forward. And unless we challenge the status quo and make people feel uncomfortable, there is never going to be an imperative for anybody to reflect on and understand their behaviour. And I think, Zora's experience of going into rooms, and I think conversations that I've had with the others of you, where there is a kind of performative, yes, we understand, we empathise, for me, I think, as Zora said, is more frustrating than knowing where people really stand and how they behave behind closed doors. So I feel now that I'm non-aligned, better able to make people feel uncomfortable, because I genuinely believe that if people are not forced to reflect on what they're doing, what they're saying, how they're saying it, when they talk to me slowly because I'm brown or black, all of those behaviours, I think, do need to be called out. And if it upsets people, I hope it helps them to go away and reflect on why they've made me upset. I'm not taking the responsibility for their actions anymore. And I think that's where being freelance has enabled me to be able to better sit down and understand that, and be in the position to kind of go, you know what, we need to either talk about this or you need to go away and think about it. That's my last piece.
You've been listening to Swati Deepak, Ponte Mafeti, Natalie Sen, Moni Chu, Stephanie Yawada Wolf, and Zora Musa talking about racism in philanthropy. And this is Healing Solidarity, Embodying Change, the second conference about reimagining international development. Thanks so much for joining us and listening to this conversation today. If you'd like to listen again or spend a little more time with the ideas discussed in this talk or in any of the others in the conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of the event and get access to recordings and resources that will help you to go deeper with these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more.